Sarah Thompson moved quickly across the empty lobby of the financial building, her cleaning cart squeaking with every turn of its small plastic wheels. The marble floor reflected the fluorescent lights above, casting back the image of a young woman whose posture carried more weight than her slender frame should allow. Her dark hair was tied back in a tight bun, and her uniform smelled faintly of bleach. To anyone passing by, she was invisible, just another anonymous worker in a city that swallowed lives whole. But behind her tired eyes, something else lived, an alertness, a spark that had refused to die, even after years of struggle. Every night, she pushed the cart from office to office, wiping away the fingerprints of powerful men who never noticed her existence. She read the memos left open on desks, heard the whispers of late-night calls echoing in the hallways. Numbers scribbled in haste, account codes left half-erased on whiteboards, documents stacked carelessly beside wastebaskets. Sarah had learned to see patterns where others saw clutter. And it was one of those nights, weeks before her world shattered, that she first realized something was wrong. The company she cleaned for was not simply a bank. It was a mask, a tunnel for money that vanished into places without names. At first, she thought she was imagining it, weaving conspiracies from scraps. But then she found a folder abandoned in a shredder bin, its contents only half destroyed. Wire transfers in the millions, names that echoed faintly in international headlines. People whispered about them, dictators, arms dealers, corporate giants with polished smiles. It was then she made the decision that would change everything. She sent copies of the files to an investigative journalist whose articles she had followed obsessively for years. That journalist was Michael Rivera. Sarah had expected silence, maybe even danger. Instead, Michael contacted her directly. His voice over the phone was steady, calm, carrying the weight of someone who had seen the worst of men and survived it. He asked questions, precise ones, and she answered with a nervous tremor that betrayed her courage. She never told him who she was, only that she wanted the truth to come out. For a brief moment, she felt powerful, but the illusion of safety shattered one cold night. When she returned to her small apartment in Sao Paulo, the door was ajar. Inside, everything was untouched, except for a single envelope placed carefully on the kitchen table. Her name was written in perfect calligraphy, Sarah Thompson. Her stomach clenched. She opened it with trembling hands, and the letter inside felt like an axe splitting her life in two. You are not who you think you are. The message continued, detailing fragments of a life she had never known. A man's name was repeated, etched with the weight of power, Hakeem al-Rashid. Her father, a billionaire whispered about in government investigations, accused of laundering money through oil empires, real estate, and international banks. A man connected to disappearances and blood. Sarah dropped the paper. Her breath caught. The name was familiar, not from her own memory, but from the anger in her mother's eyes whenever the news mentioned foreign tycoons. Mary Thompson, fragile now with sickness, had always avoided the subject of Sarah's biological father. She had married another man years ago, a kind worker who raised Sarah as his own before dying too young. Sarah never asked further. She had accepted silence as her heritage. Until now. The following evening, a black car appeared outside her building. From it stepped two men in suits, their accents heavy, their eyes unflinching. They escorted her to a hotel suite overlooking the city skyline. The curtains were drawn, the air perfumed with expensive cigars. And there he was, Hakeem al-Rashid. He looked nothing like her, and yet something in his gaze unsettled her, as if part of her own reflection had been stolen and placed in another body. His presence filled the room, calm, dangerous, regal. Sarah, he said, pronouncing her name as though it belonged to him. Or should I say, Yasmin? Her heart froze. No one had called her by her birth name in years, not even her mother. Hakeem smiled faintly, a predator pleased with the cornering of its prey. I know who you are, and you deserve the truth. But truth is costly. He poured a glass of whiskey, his movements slow, deliberate. Your mother, she is very ill, isn't she? Treatment's beyond her reach. I can change that. I can save her. Sarah's throat tightened. At what price? Hakeem leaned closer, his cologne thick, his voice silk over steel. At the price of your life as you know it. You will take a new name, a new country, and vanish. I will erase you from the eyes of those who hunt me, and in return, your mother will live. If you refuse. The silence stretched like a blade between them. His eyes did not blink. She will die without hope. Sarah's pulse roared in her ears. The walls seemed to close around her. He wasn't offering mercy. He was presenting a cage disguised as salvation. When she finally returned to her apartment, her mother was waiting in the dim light, sitting in her worn armchair, her skin pale, her breath shallow. Sarah knelt before her and confessed everything. Hakim, the letter, the offer. Mary listened in silence, her fingers trembling against her daughter's hand. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the fragile authority of a woman who had endured too much. Sarah, she whispered, you are my daughter, not his. Don't give him your soul to buy my life. Tears blurred Sarah's vision. The choice burned inside her chest. That night, she could not sleep. And when the phone rang again, it was Michael's voice on the other end. Sarah, he said urgently, it's worse than you think. Hakim is not just a man. He is a network. The files you sent me, they're just the surface. His empire funds wars, silences journalists. People like me disappear after touching his shadow. If he's reached out to you, you're already in his web. Sarah held the phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. And in that moment, she understood. She was not facing just a father she never wanted. She was facing an empire that had already claimed countless lives. The choice before her was no longer personal. It was a war, and the night had only just begun. The rain fell relentlessly over Sao Paulo, drumming against the cracked window panes of Sarah's small apartment. She sat at the kitchen table, the letter from Hakim unfolded once again in front of her. The words seemed to shift and bleed under her gaze, as if they refused to stay still, as if they mocked her inability to decide. She traced her fingers over the elegant script, her father's handwriting. Her father. The syllables felt alien in her thoughts. Mary Thompson stirred in the adjacent room, coughing weakly. Sarah pushed the letter aside and rushed to her mother's side. Mary looked fragile, her once bright brown eyes dulled by exhaustion. The illness had carved deep valleys beneath her skin, stealing her vitality day by day. Yet when Sarah held her mother's hand, she felt the same warmth that had guided her since childhood, the same strength that had taught her to rise after every fall. Mary squeezed her daughter's hand and whispered, "Don't let him break you. Don't let his wealth rewrite who you are." But Sarah's mind spun with contradictions. Hakim's words still echoed inside her. "I can save her." The offer had been cruel in its simplicity. If she surrendered her identity, her mother would live. If she resisted, her mother would die. The line between love and betrayal had never been so thin. That night, as Mary drifted back into restless sleep, Sarah sat alone and let her memories spill forward. She remembered her childhood in Recife, where the air smelled of salt and the streets were alive with music and struggle. Her stepfather, Daniel, had been the only father she ever knew. He worked as a mechanic, his hands always stained with grease, his laughter booming despite the hardships they faced. He would lift her into his arms and tell her that even the strongest engines could break, but could always be rebuilt. "You're like that too, Filha," he would say. "You'll break sometimes, but you'll always rise stronger." Daniel died when Sarah was only 13. A factory accident, quick and merciless. After that, her mother moved them to Sao Paulo, chasing work and survival. Sarah worked while studying, cleaning offices to help pay rent. She grew up fast, too fast, learning that the world rarely offered kindness to those without power. Still, she carried her stepfather's words inside her like a hidden fire. But now, Hakim's appearance threatened to rewrite even that fire. If he truly was her biological father, then half of her blood belonged to him. And if half of her blood belonged to him, what did that make her? The following day, Sarah met Michael Rivera in a small cafe far from the city center. He was careful, scanning the room before sitting opposite her. His presence was sharp yet comforting, like a blade wrapped in steady hands. He wore a worn leather jacket, his notepad tucked into the pocket, a pen always ready. His eyes studied her with quiet intensity. "You've been contacted," he said without preamble. Sarah nodded, her fingers tightening around the coffee cup. "He says he's my father." Michael leaned back, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, he said nothing. Finally, he exhaled. "That explains why they haven't killed you." Her breath caught. "What do you mean?" "Sarah, people who cross Hakim disappear. Journalists, whistleblowers, Even bankers who tried to back out of deals. They vanish. Their families vanish. But you, he reached out to you. That means you're valuable to him, more valuable than silencing you. She shivered. The idea that her survival depended not on her own choices, but on her bloodline made her skin crawl. Michael leaned forward, lowering his voice. Do you want the truth? Sarah hesitated, then nodded. The network Hakeem runs isn't just about money. It's about power, arms trafficking, offshore accounts, political manipulation. Governments look the other way because he funds campaigns, buys influence. The files you sent me, they were fragments. Enough to raise alarms, but not enough to destroy him. Somewhere out there, Hakeem keeps the real records. And if you're his daughter, you may be the only one who can get close enough to find them. Sarah's pulse quickened. The thought of becoming part of his world, even briefly, filled her with dread. But the weight of her mother's illness pressed against her chest. Michael studied her silence. He's trying to make you choose between your mother and justice, between love and truth. That's how they win. They make the choice unbearable. Her eyes burned. And if I try to fight, then you risk everything. But if you don't, you'll live the rest of your life in his shadow. Their conversation was interrupted by the shrill ring of Sarah's phone. The number was unknown, but she knew who it was before answering. Sarah. Hakeem's voice rolled through the receiver, calm and commanding. Time is short. I need your decision. She gripped the phone so tightly it hurt. I need more time. You have 3 days, he said, then hung up. The silence that followed was deafening. Michael reached across the table, his hand brushing hers. You're not alone in this. Whatever you decide, I'll help you. But if you go into his world, you need to remember, it will consume you if you're not careful. That night, Sarah walked the city streets aimlessly, the rain soaking her hair, her uniform clinging to her skin. Neon lights reflected on the wet asphalt, casting fractured colors across her path. She felt like one of those reflections, distorted, unstable, trying to find its shape. Her mother's words haunted her. Don't give him your soul. Yet Hakeem's promise was a constant whisper. I can save her. When she returned home, Mary was awake, waiting. Her eyes, though clouded with illness, held a fierce clarity. Sarah, she said softly, I know what you're thinking. But listen to me. Your life is yours. Don't let him steal it. Even if I die, I don't want that to be the price. Tears spilled down Sarah's cheeks. But, May, I can't let you go. Mary smiled faintly, her lips trembling. One day, all of us go. But what we leave behind matters. What will you leave behind if you live as his prisoner? Sarah held her mother's frail body against her own, the weight of her decision crushing her. She wanted to scream, to beg the universe for another path. But none existed. Only the impossible choice. And in the quiet of that night, she felt a shift deep inside her. Fear did not vanish, but something sharper rose beside it, defiance. She would not surrender. Not yet. The echoes of the past had spoken, and they carried both love and fury. But the future was waiting, and it was darker than she could imagine. Sarah woke to the sharp sound of her phone vibrating on the nightstand. For a moment, she thought it was Hakeem again, ready to press her for an answer, but it wasn't. It was Michael. His voice was urgent, stripped of the calm tone he usually carried. They found out you met with me, he said without preamble. Her chest tightened. What do you mean? There's surveillance footage. Someone inside the cafe must have tipped them off. You need to be careful. Hakeem's men will be watching you. Sarah pressed a hand to her temple. The world was tightening around her faster than she had imagined. She had thought she had 3 days, but maybe she had hours. Later that morning, she walked into the office building where she cleaned at night. The manager looked at her strangely, as though sensing something about her had shifted. She ignored his gaze and focused on her work, though her mind was elsewhere. Every shadow seemed alive, every glance a threat. That evening, as she left the building, a man in a gray suit stepped into her path. His voice was polite, but his eyes were sharp. Miss Thompson, the car is waiting. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but she forced herself to remain calm. She followed, slipping into the black car's leather seat. Inside, Hakeem sat waiting, his presence as heavy as the night itself. You've wasted enough time, he said. Your hesitation is dangerous. For you, and for your mother. Sarah clenched her fists. You can't control me. Hakeem's smile was faint, cruel. You think you have choices, but you don't. The only choice is how much you are willing to lose. The car pulled away, the city lights fading as they drove toward the outskirts. Sarah's heart pounded as fear and anger warred inside her. She wanted to scream, but she forced her voice to remain steady. If I agree, if I take this new identity, I want proof that my mother will be safe. Hakim studied her carefully. You will see her in the best hospital with the best doctors. That is the only proof you need. She bit back her rage. His game was clear. Dangle her mother's life before her like a marionette, forcing her to dance. But she wasn't going to be a puppet forever. That night, after being dropped back at her apartment, she found Michael waiting by the corner. He had taken the risk to come to her, knowing he could be followed. His eyes searched hers. What did he say? Sarah's voice was trembling but resolute. He thinks he owns me. He doesn't. I'll play along. I'll make him believe I accept. But I won't vanish. I'll get close enough to find what he's hiding. Michael's jaw tightened. That's dangerous. I don't care, she whispered. I won't let him win. For the first time since this nightmare began, Sarah felt something new, a plan. A fragile one, born of desperation, but a plan nonetheless. The confrontation had begun, and there was no turning back. The mansion was unlike anything Sarah had ever seen. Its marble floors gleamed like frozen rivers, chandeliers glittered with cold fire, and guards patrolled the hallways with silent precision. She had been brought there after agreeing to Hakim's proposal, at least outwardly. Hakim welcomed her with a measured smile. You see, daughter, this is the life you were meant to have. Sarah's stomach twisted. She wasn't here to marvel at luxury. She was here to find the cracks, the weaknesses. To him, this place was a fortress. To her, it was a gilded cage. The days passed in a strange rhythm. Hakim insisted she attend dinners with his associates, men who spoke in coded language about markets, assets, and territories. Sarah listened carefully, memorizing details, filing away every scrap of information. She played her role convincingly, nodding, smiling faintly, asking just enough questions to seem curious but not threatening. One night, after a tense dinner, she found herself alone with Hakim in his study. He poured whiskey into crystal glasses, his eyes studying her with something softer than usual. You remind me of your mother, he said quietly. Sarah's breath caught. He had never spoken of Mary before. She was strong, Hakim continued. Too strong for her own good. That's why I let her go. But I never stopped thinking of her. For a fleeting moment, Sarah glimpsed something human in him. Regret, or perhaps just the shadow of it. She felt a pang of confusion, torn between hatred and an unfamiliar sense of connection. Then came the twist. Hakim unlocked a hidden drawer and revealed a small metal key. Come, he said. He led her down into the mansion's basement, past reinforced doors and biometric locks, until they reached a chamber colder than ice. In the center stood a vault, its steel face gleaming under fluorescent light. Hakim inserted the key and pressed his palm against the scanner. The door hissed open. Inside were rows of files, hard drives, and folders stacked with meticulous order. Names, numbers, contracts, evidence of an empire built on corruption and blood. Sarah's heart raced. She had found it. Hakim's voice broke her trance. This is my legacy, and one day it could be yours. Sarah forced herself to nod, masking the storm within. She knew what she had to do. That night, she memorized the vault's details, the locks, the layout, the position of cameras. Later, she found a way to slip a message to Michael, hidden in the pages of a book she knew would reach him. But her small act of rebellion did not go unnoticed. By dawn, the walls of the mansion would no longer feel as safe or as silent. The morning after she glimpsed the vault, Sarah felt the change in the air. The guards were more alert, their eyes sharper. Somewhere, someone had grown suspicious. At breakfast, she sat across from Hakim, who sipped his coffee without a word. His silence was heavier than anger. Then the door opened, and a new figure entered. Ahmed Al-Anshuri, Hakim's closest ally. His presence was venomous, his gaze predatory. He kissed Hakim on both cheeks before turning to Sarah. So this is the daughter, Ahmed said, his tone dripping with contempt. Beautiful, brave, but I wonder, is she trustworthy? Sarah met his gaze, forcing herself not to flinch. Trust is earned. Ahmed laughed, a hollow, cruel sound, spoken like someone who knows nothing of our world. Throughout the day, Ahmed's shadow followed her. He asked probing questions, watched her every move. Sarah knew then that he suspected her, and suspicion in this world was more dangerous than proof. That evening, she retreated to the mansion's garden, where moonlight draped the fountains in silver. Michael had managed to send her a coded message, slipped through the same contact who had carried her note. "Be careful. They're onto you." Her chest tightened. The noose was tightening. But not all was bleak. Among the staff, she found an unlikely ally, a maid named Layla, whose family had once been destroyed by men like Ahmed. Layla recognized the fear in Sarah's eyes and whispered, "I'll help you, but you must be fast. They won't forgive betrayal." An alliance had been forged in the shadows. Yet for every step Sarah took toward exposing Hakim, Ahmed loomed closer, his suspicion deepening. The mansion was no longer just a cage. It had become a battlefield. The mansion had begun to feel suffocating, its ornate halls lined with silent watchers and heavy shadows. Sarah moved through it with careful grace, her heart thudding each time she passed a guard who seemed to linger a little too long with his stare. Yet beneath her calm exterior, her mind was in constant motion, piecing together fragments of conversations, gestures, and whispered exchanges. It was Layla who first gave her the crack in the facade. The maid approached her late one evening, her eyes darting nervously to the surveillance camera above the corridor before she spoke. "They hide everything in symbols," Layla whispered. "The paintings, the books, the objects, they're all codes. Your father's empire doesn't just exist in numbers. It exists in stories only a few are taught to read." Sarah studied her intently. "And you know how to read them?" Layla hesitated, then nodded faintly. "Enough. Enough to know that the vault you saw is only part of it. There are places beneath the city, safe houses, warehouses, vaults under fake company names. If Ahmed suspects you, it's because he fears you'll discover more than your father wants you to see." Sarah's chest tightened. The realization was staggering. Hakim had shown her the vault not out of trust, but perhaps as a trap, a way to lure her into believing she had seen everything, when in truth the real heart of the network lay hidden deeper still. That night, Sarah wandered into the library. The room stretched endlessly, its shelves filled with leather-bound books that smelled of age and dust. She traced her hand along the spines, pausing at one particularly worn volume, The Arabian Nights. She pulled it free, and as she did, a folded piece of paper fluttered out. Her breath caught. On the page was a diagram, a map of Sao Paulo, marked with 3 small red crosses. Beneath each cross was a date. One of them was tomorrow. Her pulse raced. This wasn't coincidence. It was a schedule. Something was happening, and soon. Before she could hide the paper, the door creaked open. Hakim stepped inside, his expression unreadable. He noticed the book in her hands and raised an eyebrow. "Curious, are we?" Sarah's throat went dry. "I couldn't sleep." Hakim's gaze lingered on her, sharp and penetrating, but he said nothing more. He only walked to the desk, poured himself a glass of wine, and sat down with a sigh. "Curiosity can be dangerous, daughter, but it can also be useful if you are strong enough to handle what you find." Sarah forced a smile, slipping the paper into her sleeve when his eyes drifted away. "Maybe I am stronger than you think." Hakim gave a low chuckle. "Perhaps, but strength is not enough. You must also know when to hide it." Later that night, in the privacy of her room, Sarah copied the map onto a blank sheet and prepared to send it discreetly to Michael. The risk was enormous, but she couldn't let the opportunity slip. If these marks were tied to operations, then exposing them might be the first real strike against Hakim's empire. But as dawn approached, the consequences of her actions revealed themselves. Guards stormed the library, overturning books and searching shelves. Ahmed had discovered something missing. He was close, too close. Sarah's secret was no longer safe, and the walls around her were beginning to close in. The following day arrived with a weight that pressed against Sarah's chest like stone. She hadn't slept, her mind replaying Hakim's warning and Ahmed's ever-watchful eyes. The map was hidden in her boot, but every step she took made her feel as though the floor beneath her might shatter and reveal the truth. At breakfast, Hakim sat at the head of the long table, calm as ever. Ahmed, however, was restless. His eyes darted towards Sarah again and again, suspicion radiating from him like heat. "She is hiding something," Ahmed said bluntly. Hakim's brow arched. "And what makes you so certain?" "Because I would, if I were her." The silence that followed was suffocating. Sarah forced herself to meet Ahmed's gaze without flinching, though her heart thundered in her chest. Hakim dismissed the accusation with a wave of his hand, but Sarah knew better than to think the matter was closed. Ahmed would not rest until he uncovered whatever he believed she was concealing. That night, Sarah stole away into the garden. The air was heavy with jasmine, the fountain's trickle muffled beneath the pounding of her pulse. She was waiting for Layla, who had promised to help her slip the map into the hands of a contact outside the mansion. Layla arrived late, her face pale, her movements jittery. "It's too dangerous," she whispered. "They are watching me, too. Ahmed suspects everyone now." But she pressed a small folded cloth into Sarah's hand. Inside was a key, crude but solid. "This opens a door in the east wing. There's a tunnel that leads to the old wine cellars. If you must escape, that is your only chance." Sarah swallowed hard, torn between gratitude and dread. Escape. The very thought felt both liberating and terrifying. But she couldn't run, not yet. She needed to finish what she had started. Moments later, she heard footsteps crunching against gravel. Ahmed. He was coming toward them, his silhouette sharp in the moonlight. Layla slipped away into the shadows, leaving Sarah alone to face him. Ahmed stopped in front of her, his smile cold. "You wander too much, daughter of Hakim." Sarah kept her voice steady. "And you watch too much." Ahmed's chuckle was low, humorless. "I have seen people like you before, pretending loyalty, waiting for the right moment to strike. Do you know what happens to them?" He leaned closer, his voice a venomous whisper. "They don't last long." Sarah's fists tightened at her sides, but she forced herself to hold his gaze. "Then maybe you should be more careful about what you assume." Ahmed's eyes narrowed, but before he could reply, Hakim's voice rang out from the terrace. "Enough." Ahmed stepped back reluctantly, but his glare promised retribution. Sarah returned to her room that night knowing the truth. There was no more middle ground. She had crossed into territory from which there was no return. The map was in her possession, Michael was waiting for her signal, and Hakim's empire was closer to unraveling than ever. But with Ahmed circling, suspicion festering, and her mother's life hanging by a thread, she knew one thing for certain. The real war had only just begun. The night after her confrontation with Ahmed felt endless. Sarah lay awake, staring at the ceiling of her gilded prison, her body still tense from the venom in his words. She knew Ahmed's suspicion was not an idle threat. He was a predator, patient and relentless, and he would not stop until he uncovered her secret. Every shadow in the mansion seemed sharper now, every corner humming with danger. By dawn, the first consequence of her hidden defiance appeared. The guards doubled in number. Metal detectors were installed at the entrances, and Ahmed personally supervised the searches. Sarah's heart skipped when a guard demanded she remove her boots. For a split second, she thought the map hidden inside would be discovered. But fate intervened. Hakim appeared in the corridor, waving impatiently. "Enough," Hakim ordered. "She is under my protection." Ahmed's lips curled, but he obeyed. Sarah slipped away, her pulse thundering, knowing she had escaped discovery by a hair's breadth. Later that day, Hakim summoned her into his study. He sat behind the grand oak desk, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. The room smelled of sandalwood and smoke, and the silence between them was heavy. "You are different," Hakim said finally. "I see your mother in you, her fire, her stubbornness. But I also see myself. The question is, which half will you embrace?" Sarah's voice was steady, though her hands trembled in her lap. "I am neither you nor her. I am myself." Hakim's eyes softened for a fraction of a second. Then the softness vanished. "If that is true, you will need to prove it." Before she could respond, Ahmed entered without knocking. "There has been a breach," he said sharply. "One of our warehouses was raided last night. Police found nothing, but they were too close. Someone tipped them off." Sarah's heart clenched. "Michael. He must have acted on the map she sent." Hakim's jaw tightened, his composure cracking for the first time. "Find the leak," he commanded. Ahmed's gaze slid toward Sarah, sharp as a blade. "Perhaps the leak is closer than you think." Hakim's eyes flickered toward her, just briefly. That flicker was enough to chill her blood. That evening, Sarah slipped away into the tunnels Layla had shown her. She followed the passage until it opened into the abandoned wine cellars, where dust and cobwebs clung to the stone walls. There, hidden among crates, Michael waited. His face was tense, his eyes ringed with exhaustion. "We confirmed it," he whispered. "The map led us to a warehouse used to move money through fake charities. We shut it down, but they know someone inside betrayed them." Sarah bit her lip. "Ahmed suspects me. He won't stop until he proves it." Michael grasped her hands. "Then you need to make him believe otherwise. Give him something that makes you seem loyal." Her stomach twisted at the thought. "If I play loyal, I risk becoming part of it." Michael's gaze was steady. "If you don't, you won't survive long enough to finish this." Their meeting ended quickly. Sarah slipped back into the mansion unseen, her mind spinning. She knew Michael was right. To live, she would have to deceive not only Ahmed, but Hakim too. That night, she made her choice. During dinner, when Ahmed pressed her again, accusing eyes drilling into her, Sarah leaned forward and spoke with quiet steel. "You doubt me? Then test me. Give me a task. Let me prove myself." Ahmed smirked, but his eyes glinted with triumph. Very well. The task he gave her would forever change the path she walked. For the first time, Sarah was asked to dirty her hands for Hakim's empire. The consequences of her infiltration were no longer theoretical. They were here, clawing at her with every breath. And there was no undoing what she was about to step into. The task was deceptively simple. Deliver a sealed envelope to a contact in the city. No questions asked, no deviations allowed. A test of loyalty. A trap. Hakim watched her carefully as Ahmed handed her the envelope. The paper felt heavy in her palm, as though it contained not just words, but a future she couldn't yet see. She forced herself to nod, hiding the storm within. The car ride into Sao Paulo was suffocating. 2 guards sat in the front, silent and armed. Sarah stared out the window at the familiar streets, their vibrancy muted by fear. She longed to leap out, to run, but she knew that would only doom her and her mother. At the cafe where she was instructed to go, a man in a dark suit waited. His eyes scanned her face before he accepted the envelope. "Hakim's daughter," he murmured with a strange reverence. "Welcome to the family." The words made her skin crawl. When she returned to the mansion, Ahmed was waiting. "And, did you deliver it?" "Yes." "Did you open it?" Sarah's voice was sharp. "No. I know what loyalty means." Ahmed's smile was thin. "Perhaps you do." But later that night, Layla found her trembling in her room. "Do you want to know what you carried?" the maid whispered. "I overheard the men talking. It was a list, names of journalists, activists, dissidents, targets." Sarah's stomach dropped. The envelope had been a death sentence, delivered by her own hand. The weight of it crushed her. She had wanted to infiltrate, to gather information, to strike from within. Instead, she had become complicit. The truth was unbearable. Every step deeper into Hakim's world risked staining her with blood she could never wash away. That night, sleep refused her. She wandered back to the library, where the hidden paper had first fallen from the book. Desperate, she searched through the shelves again. This time, behind a row of encyclopedias, she found a leather-bound journal. Its cover was embossed with Hakim's initials. Her hands shook as she opened it. Inside were notes written in his meticulous hand, accounts of operations, financial flows, even names of officials on his payroll. But deeper into the journal, Sarah found something else, letters addressed to her mother. Unsent. Her breath caught. She read the first one, written 20 years ago. "Mary, I could not protect you then. They would have killed us both. But I never forgot you. And I never forgot the child." Tears blurred her vision. Was it possible? Was there a version of Hakim who had once loved her mother, who had once been more than a monster? Or was this just another mask, another manipulation? The buried truth was clear. Her life was built on secrets, some too painful to bear, others too dangerous to reveal. But one thing was certain, Ahmed would not stop. Her betrayal would be exposed. Her mother was still a hostage to Hakim's mercy, and the list she had carried meant death was already on its way to others. Sarah closed the journal, her resolve hardening. She couldn't let this continue. The time for half measures was ending. The next move would either save them all, or destroy her completely. The days leading up to the inevitable confrontation were a storm without pause. Sarah could feel the noose tightening with every passing hour. The journal she had found still haunted her. Hakim's careful handwriting, his unsent letters to her mother, the hints of a man who might once have been something other than the ruthless king of a criminal empire. But she could not afford to let sentiment cloud her vision. Every moment of hesitation could mean death for Mary, for Michael, and for countless innocents whose names appeared on those cursed lists. Ahmed's suspicion grew unbearable. He followed her like a shadow, his words always laced with venom. "You think blood ties protect you," he told her one morning, his voice low and sharp as a knife. "But blood is easily spilled. Prove me wrong, or I will prove myself right." Hakim, on the other hand, seemed conflicted. He invited Sarah into private conversations late at night, speaking of philosophy, of power, of legacy. Sometimes he even spoke of regret. "Every empire is built on bones," he said as he stared into the fire. "The question is whether those bones are forgotten or remembered." Sarah wanted to spit the words back at him, to tell him that bones did not become less real because men like him cloaked them in metaphors. But she bit her tongue. She needed him to trust her for just a little longer. Meanwhile, she and Michael had established a fragile line of communication. Through Layla's help, Sarah smuggled fragments of Hakim's journal out of the mansion. Michael, ever resourceful, began weaving them into a larger tapestry, building a case that could finally bring down the empire. But time was their greatest enemy. Ahmed was too close, and Mary's health was deteriorating rapidly. Then came the call that shattered any illusions of safety. Sarah had just returned from a forced dinner with Hakim's associates when her phone rang. The number was unknown, but the voice was unmistakable, Ahmed's. "We have your mother," he said coldly. "Did you really think we would leave such a weakness unattended? If you want her alive, you will meet us. No tricks, no delays." Her blood turned to ice. "Where?" "You'll know soon enough. And bring nothing with you. No messages, no allies. Just yourself." The line went dead. Sarah's knees buckled, and for the first time in weeks, her mask cracked. Tears spilled freely. Her mother was no longer just sick, she was a hostage. Hakim entered the room a moment later, his face grim. "Ahmed has overstepped," he said. "This is not what I wanted." Sarah's rage erupted. "Not what you wanted. This is your world, your empire. You let men like him run free, and now my mother will pay the price." Hakim's expression darkened, but beneath the steel, something broke. "I will come with you," he said finally. Sarah stared at him, stunned. "Why?" "Because Ahmed no longer serves me. He serves himself. And if he wins, everything I built will be his. Perhaps it is time this ended." For the first time, Sarah saw something in Hakim's eyes that she had never seen before. Resolve not for power, but for redemption, however twisted. They prepared together. Hakim gathered loyal men, though he warned Sarah not to trust them completely. Michael was contacted through coded signals, though Sarah knew he would arrive regardless of her warnings to stay away. The night before they left, Sarah sat alone in her room. She thought of her stepfather, Daniel, whose laughter had once filled their small home. She thought of her mother's hands, rough from work but gentle in love. And she thought of Michael, whose courage mirrored her own, whose presence had become her anchor in this chaos. She whispered a promise to the darkness: "I will not let this be in vain." The next day, the confrontation would begin, and only one side would walk away. The warehouse loomed on the edge of the industrial district, its windows broken, its walls stained with rust. Floodlights bathed the exterior in harsh white, and armed men patrolled the perimeter with restless vigilance. Sarah's stomach knotted as the car slowed to a stop. Inside, the air was thick with the stench of oil and sweat. Mary was there, bound to a chair at the center of the room. Her face was pale, her breath shallow, but her eyes lit up when she saw her daughter. "Sarah," she whispered, her voice trembling. Sarah surged forward, but Ahmed blocked her path. His smile was cruel, triumphant. "So the daughter comes to save the mother. How poetic." Hakim stepped forward, his presence commanding, though his men were outnumbered. "This was not the agreement, Ahmed. Release her." Ahmed laughed, the sound echoing through the cavernous space. "You are no longer in control, old man. The empire belongs to those who have the will to keep it. And you," he sneered, "you've gone soft." He turned to Sarah, his eyes gleaming with malice. "You have something I want. The evidence. The files. The journal you thought you could hide. Give them to me, and maybe, I will let her live." Sarah's chest heaved. She could feel every gaze in the room pressing against her, every gun trained on her trembling body. Mary's voice broke through the chaos. Weak but unwavering, she called out, "Don't do it, Feelha. Don't trade justice for me. My life is one. But those files, they can save thousands. Tears streamed down Sarah's face. May, please. Mary shook her head, her eyes burning with fierce love. Don't let my death mean nothing. Few people get the chance to die for something that matters. Let me. Ahmed snarled and pressed a gun against Mary's temple. Enough of this. Sarah's scream tore through the warehouse. Stop. But even as she shouted, she realized her choice had already been made. She couldn't hand over the files. She couldn't betray everything she had fought for. She raised her chin, her voice breaking but resolute. You'll kill her either way, but you won't win. For a heartbeat, silence reigned. Then chaos erupted. The sound of gunfire split the air as the doors burst open. Federal police stormed the warehouse, their shouts drowning out the crack of rifles. Michael was among them, his face pale but determined, leading the charge. Bullets flew, sparks ignited, screams filled the night. Sarah dove to shield her mother, her body trembling with fear and fury. Hakim fought too, to her shock, placing himself between her and Ahmed's men, his pistol firing with brutal precision. Ahmed roared with rage. He grabbed Mary by the hair, dragging her upright as a shield. This ends now, he shouted, pressing the barrel of his gun against her skull. But Hakim was faster. With a cry that echoed with years of regret, he threw himself forward, tackling Ahmed to the ground. The gun fired, the sound deafening, but when the smoke cleared, Mary was alive, and Hakim lay bleeding on the concrete. Sarah's scream ripped through the chaos. She crawled to him, her hands pressing against the wound in his chest. No, stay with me. Hakim's eyes met hers, softer than she had ever seen them. You are stronger than me, stronger than I ever was. Don't waste it. Then his body went still. Ahmed, pinned by federal agents, screamed curses as they dragged him away. His empire, his ambitions, crumbled in an instant. But for Sarah, the moment of truth was not victory. It was loss, raw, agonizing loss. Her mother wept quietly beside her. Michael knelt close, his hand steady on her shoulder. The empire had fallen, but at a cost that would haunt her forever. The city woke to a pale, forgiving light the morning after the raid, as if Sao Paulo itself had decided to exhale. Sirens had faded into memory, cordons were lifted, and the empty warehouse sat like a husk along the river, an echo, not a threat. Hospitals filled the silence with steadier rhythms. Monitors, shoes on linoleum, the hushed lecture of doctors explaining outcomes that teetered between miracle and math. In one of those rooms, Mary Thompson slept under a clean blanket that smelled faintly of starch and lavender. A white band circled her wrist. A new plan circled her life. Sarah sat in a plastic chair and watched her mother's chest rise and fall. The fluorescent light cut a rectangle over Mary's face, revealing the milder color now warming her cheeks. The government had moved quickly, faster than anyone expected. Asset seizures, emergency authorizations, a fund for protected witnesses and their families. Some bills were paid from accounts once used to move money to ghost charities. The rest came from donations Michael had helped wrangle with a ferocity that surprised even him. It was not charity alone. It was restitution, redirected from the mouth of a machine that had fed on lives. When Mary woke, she reached out blindly, fingers brushing the air until Sarah took her hand. You look older, Mary said, voice thin but amused. And stronger. I feel both, Sarah answered. I think strength makes you older when you use it. Then we'll spend it slowly, Mary whispered, and closed her eyes again. News traveled in fragments, televised images, clipped interviews, articles rushing to be first but rarely the most complete. Ahmed was charged under a knot of statutes that lawyers adored and criminals feared. Dozens of arrests followed across 3 continents. Names that once demanded private dining rooms now queued in holding cells. Hakim's men splintered, some vanishing, some bargaining, some finally speaking after years of cultivated silence. And regarding Hakim himself, the story that spread was simple, elegant, and incorrect. The fallen king who bled out on concrete, undone by sentiment. That narrative was tidy, and the world loved tidy ends. But it was not true. He survived in the margins, in the space the bullet missed by a few millimeters, and the surgeons seized with gloved hands and practiced audacity. He survived long enough to be handcuffed to a bed, to stare at a ceiling he did not own, to sign a confession in ink that bled like the wound under his gown. He survived long enough to speak with a public defender and then with someone far sharper, a quiet woman who explained the arithmetic of cooperation. He survived long enough for Sarah to walk into a visiting room, where the glass between them was thick and the phone receiver was cold, and nothing in the fluorescent glare could lie. They said nothing at first. The shape of him, the once immovable architecture, looked smaller, as if someone had opened a hidden valve and let the air escape. He lifted the receiver with the slowness of a man discovering weight for the first time. "You came," he said. "I wasn't sure I would," she answered. "I'm still not sure why I did." He watched her as though cataloging the uncertainty itself. "To see whether the monster bleeds. To learn whether you have inherited my cruelty. To put the past in a room and lock the door from the outside." A faint smile touched his lips and fell away. Or perhaps to say goodbye properly, not with shouting and smoke. She thought of the journal, of the unsent letters to her mother. "Did you write those because you regretted what you did?" she asked, "or because you liked the sound of your regret?" His laugh was small and honest, a stone skipping twice before it sank. "Both. I built a theater and lived in it. But the bullet tore the curtain. I have been watching the truth, without costume, for the first time in years." "You used me," she said. She had to place the words into the room. Otherwise they would remain in her throat forever. "You put my mother on a scale and asked me to balance justice with her life." "I did," he said. "And before you accuse me again, know that I am accusing myself more loudly than you ever could." He leaned toward the glass. "I will give them everything. Names, numbers, accounts. I will testify. Not to buy your forgiveness. I know what I cost. But to pay the world something back while there is still currency in my hands." She studied his face, searching for a flicker of the man who had guided bullets with spreadsheets and moved wars with a whisper. There was a strange peace there, not absolution but the clarity that sometimes follows an impact. "There will be a trial," she said. "You'll face people whose lives you hollowed out to build your empire. When they ask you who you are, what will you say? Hakim the visionary? The victim of his own ambition? The repentant father?" "I will say I was a liar," he answered. "And then I will prove it by telling the truth." The line hummed. She wanted, absurdly, to reach through the thickness and press her hand against his, to test whether warmth traveled through shame. Instead, she set the receiver down gently and stood. "You taught me to count what matters," she said softly, "by trying to buy what cannot be bought." She held his gaze. "I am not Yasmin. I am Sarah. And I am leaving the door unlocked behind me, because I never intend to walk back through it." On the day of the hearing, rain painted the courthouse steps. Michael waited at the bottom with an umbrella, his tie slightly crooked and his eyes bright with fatigue. He had barely left the newsroom. His name stood under headlines he never bothered to reread. "They seated the panel," he said as they climbed. "Special prosecutors. The judge is stern, which is the polite word journalists use when they mean terrifying." "Good," Sarah said. "Terrifying might keep the world awake." Inside, the room smelled of wood and tension. Victims spoke. Former accountants testified. The vault, the maps, the offshore ladders built from shell companies and blind trusts. All of it unspooled in language even the least financial among them could feel, if not parse. When it was Mary's turn to describe the threats, Sarah held her breath. Her mother's voice shook but did not break. She spoke as though laying bricks. By the end, a path existed where grief had been. Hakim's testimony came later, precise as a ledger. He named the discreet service providers who had smiled through compliance meetings and smuggled disobedience into the footnotes. He diagrammed how a donation becomes a weapon if you launder it in the chapel before handing it to a general. He did not look for Sarah. Once, he glanced toward Mary, and she lowered her eyes, forgiving nothing and allowing everything to pass through her silence without catching. The sentence, when it came, was not poetry. Years stacked like crates. Restitution obligations long enough to outlive him. Restrictions that stripped his life down to a cot and a table. Outside, cameras flashed, then turned their appetite toward the next scandal waiting behind the next polished door. Inside, a simpler machine clicked into motion. Consequences finally attached to names. In the months that followed, life did not return to normal because normal had never been theirs. It grew around the wound like new skin. Mary's treatment responded, haltingly at first, then with a stubbornness that matched her daughter's. On afternoons when the nausea stayed away, she sat on the balcony and watered basil in a plastic pot, smiling at the smell on her fingers. She spoke of Daniel, of engines and repairs, of the way good men keep machines alive with patience instead of speed. Sometimes she fell asleep mid-sentence, sentences finishing themselves in the warm dusk. Sarah filled out applications at a small desk by the window, chewing the end of a pen she never remembered to replace. In essays, she wrote about the arithmetic of power and the civics of survival. She wrote about floors and fingerprints, about how the invisible learn to see the edges of certainty because they spend their lives trying not to be cut by them. She wrote, without naming him, about a man who mistook secrecy for strength and then discovered that the opposite of secrecy is not weakness but breath. The letter arrived on a day that smelled like rain but chose sunlight instead. She opened it on the stairwell because she could not wait the extra 40 seconds to reach her apartment door. A scholarship full. A cohort that prided itself on turning witnesses into advocates, survivors into attorneys who could translate pain into precedent. She pressed the paper to her chest and laughed, the sound echoing up and down the shaft like a bell. "Let me guess," Michael said when she burst into the newsroom later, cheeks flushed and hair wild from running. "They want you." "Of course they do." He stood, and for a second the entire room around them, the clack of keyboards, the hum of machines, vanished under the cleaner noise of relief. She handed him the letter. He read it, then set it down on the desk as though it might break if he held it too tightly. "So," he said, eyes bright. "Partner." The word hung in the air with layered meaning, and he left it there on purpose, allowing it to gather the life it deserved. She nodded. "Partner," she said, and meant both the byline and the other thing, the quieter allegiance that had grown in the spaces between danger and decision. They did not kiss in the newsroom. They were too professional for that, and too superstitious to tempt the gods. Instead, he walked her to the door and, before letting her go, tapped the letter with his knuckle. "Start studying," he teased. "The world is not going to cross-examine itself." They found an office no bigger than a bedroom over a bakery that rose bread at 4 in the morning and perfumed the air the rest of the day. A second-hand metal shelf held casebooks and a ceramic mug where donors' checks mingled with coins that children dropped into the slot because their parents told them the jar made wishes work harder. On the wall, they hung a framed page from the government's restitution memo, not as decoration, but as a reminder that money, once unmoored, can still be tethered back to the people from whom it was stolen. They called the organization Lumen, because the first work of justice is to make the dark visible without turning people into exhibits. Volunteers brought laptops and questions. Retired investigators came on Tuesdays. A young accountant arrived with the shyness of someone who had fled a job with a view and found meaning in a room with a window that stuck in the heat. Lumen took calls from whistleblowers in the morning and held quiet consultations in the late afternoon with families whose bank accounts had been used as conduits and then closed like traps. Sarah wrote procedures, drafted privacy pledges in plain language, stole time every night to read about evidence rules until the print blurred. Sometimes she went to the prison. Not every week, not out of obligation, and never out of habit. Just often enough to keep the truth from becoming a rumor, she told herself to sleep. The visiting room remained ugly. Plastic chairs, a clock that ran 3 minutes fast, a vending machine that made its own weather. Hakeem had thinned. His clothes hung on him like duplicate thoughts. The guards learned to look away when he smiled at his daughter. Not indulgence, simply an acknowledgement that grief has a right to pass without spectators. "I hear you have founded a light," he said once, nodding at the brochure she left on the counter. "Let it shine where the ledgers lie." "It will," she said, "and not because it will make you smaller, but because it will make others visible." He didn't ask for forgiveness again. When he spoke of Mary, he did so carefully, placing her at the center of memories where he had no right to stand. Once he asked whether Mary would ever visit. Sarah told him no. He nodded, accepting the answer as both verdict and mercy. Her first day of classes came with the dry sound of pages turning and the electric buzz of a room deciding who it would become. Professors asked Socratic questions with the enthusiasm of people who had discovered a better instrument than accusation. Sarah raised her hand rarely, speaking when the case smelled like fear or sounded like math. Between lectures, she returned calls to clients who had sent documents through encrypted portals, stories through trembling voices. At night, she rode until her fingers cramped, then slept in a chair with a book on her chest, and woke with a crease on her cheek that would not smooth for hours. Michael teased her about the crease. He brought empanadas and stories and a habit of leaving small, useful items on her desk: highlighters, a portable charger, a photograph of the two of them laughing at something that no longer mattered. He made the space solid around her, as if his presence were a wall that could keep out the weather she brought back from court. One afternoon, months into this new life, she stood before a room of students and street vendors, nurses and night shift guards, a collage of the city that fed itself on miracles and bad coffee. Lumen had organized a workshop in a community center where the paint peeled and the chairs didn't match and the sound system worked because a teenager had bullied it into obedience. The topic was simple and enormous: how to recognize financial predation before it wore your mother's name. She told them how to read a receipt like a paragraph, how to photograph a ledger so the numbers don't run, how to ask a bank for documents without being ushered into a labyrinth designed to make you forget your own question. A man in the back raised his hand. "Why should we trust you?" he asked, not hostile, just careful. "You were in a house with chandeliers." "I was," she said. The room quieted. "And I am here because I learned that chandeliers don't light anything you need to see." She felt the words leave her and knew they were true enough to walk on. Trust isn't a contract. It's a practice. Let me earn it by showing up tomorrow and the day after that. They applauded not because the line was beautiful, but because it sounded like work. That evening, as the sun bled into the river and painted the glass towers with borrowed gold, Sarah returned to the office and found Mary sitting by the window with a folder on her lap. Her mother had become a frequent visitor, the basil thriving in a cracked pot on the sill. "I brought you something," Mary said. "A certificate." Sarah took the paper. It was ordinary, black ink, a seal embossed in a corner. A registration for an organization with a name the world had not learned yet. Mary had signed on the dotted line as co-founder. "You built this," Mary said, voice thick with pride. "Now let me carry a corner." They laughed, and then they cried for a while, because laughter and tears sit on the same shelf in their family and sometimes reach for the same glass. The last pages of the old story turned themselves. Ahmed was transferred, appealed, lost. A former auditor fled and then returned, trailing a plea agreement like a kite with a short string. Governments argued over jurisdiction and then agreed to divide the carcass, each taking a fair share of guilt and tax. Newspapers moved on. Scandals are seasonal. The work of repair is perennial and doesn't sell. On a morning that tasted like clean air, Sarah walked alone to the edge of the city where the river widened and forgot to hurry. She thought of a key pressed into her palm in a moonlit garden, of tunnels and vaults and hidden rooms that had seemed inevitable until they were not. She thought of Daniel's hands, of Mary's laughter, of Michael's tired, happy eyes when a lead became a fact and a fact became a paragraph, and a paragraph made power flinch. She thought of Hakeem sitting at a table whose surface remembered more elbows than his, compiling a list of losses he would never redeem. She closed her eyes and listened, to water against stone, to the breath that belongs to the living and the dead and the part of the world that refuses to keep quiet. When she opened them, the city lay in front of her like a complicated map made finally legible, not because it had become simpler, but because she knew now which symbols meant danger and which meant door. She walked back toward the office, not quickly, not slowly, the kind of pace that announces permanence. On her desk waited a stack of intake forms, a brief to finalize, a lecture to prepare for a group of night students who believed, as she did, that knowledge is a tool and a shelter. On the wall, the memo's framed page hung steady, a promise made literal. In the reflection on the office window, she caught a flash of herself, hair pulled back, eyes steady, shoulders set, not the ghost of a name she no longer carried, not the silhouette of a man standing behind her. Just Sarah Thompson, a woman whose life had been stolen and then reclaimed piece by careful piece, who had kept the evidence and lost the illusions, who now held a different kind of key. Outside, the street lifted its ordinary music, a bus brake huffing, a bicycle bell, a child's laugh ricocheting off tile. Inside, a phone rang, and she answered it. And when the caller said they were afraid, she said, "I know. Come in." She reached for a pad, uncapped a pen, and began to take notes with the crisp patience of someone who has learned that the most radical thing a person can do is listen long enough for another person's truth to become useful. The light through the window changed from bright to warm to the kind of blue that makes promises. She did not move until the work for the day could sleep untroubled. And when she finally stepped into the evening, the city met her without disguises, the horizon not a line but a verb, something you do with your feet and your will and your name. If you made it this far, leave us a comment telling us where you're watching from today and what you thought of the story. If you can, share this video with your friends and family, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell to receive new videos. A big hug, and see you tomorrow.